On February 24th, 1995, at 11:15 p.m., firefighters rushed to an apartment complex in Shoreline, Washington, just north of Seattle. The call came in as a structure fire, routine enough. But as they pulled up to 2208 NE 197th Place, they could see flames eating through a ground floor unit, smoke billowing into the cold February night air. The windows had blown out from the heat. Orange light flickered against the dark sky. When they finally knocked down the fire and stepped inside, they found something that made even seasoned first responders turn away. Renee Powell's body lay positioned in her living room in a way that was clearly intentional, clearly staged. An ice pick had been placed between her legs like some kind of grotesque signature. Fresh iced tea sat on the counter. The ice cubes melted from the heat, but the glass still standing upright. Clean laundry was folded neatly on her sofa, waiting for hands that would never touch it again. The apartment told a story. Renee had been doing everyday things, making tea, folding clothes, living her life. And then someone had shattered that normalcy in the most violent way possible. But here's what made this case different from every other fire investigation these firefighters had seen. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even just arson to cover up a robbery. Someone had ended Renee's life, assaulted her, bound her with electrical cords cut from her own lamps, staged her body with deliberate cruelty, stolen her belongings, and then tried to burn away the evidence. The fire had been set in multiple places throughout the apartment. The smoke detectors had been removed before the fire started. This was planned. This was methodical. This was evil with a strategy. And exactly 1 month later, they would do it again, in the same apartment complex, to another woman who lived alone, just a few doors down from where Renee had lived. Renee Powell was 43 years old and full of life in a way that made people remember her. She'd come to Seattle from Arkansas in 1993, originally just for a vacation. But something about the city captured her heart. The coffee shops on every corner, the music scene exploding with grunge bands, the smell of salt water mixing with rain, the promise of reinvention that the Pacific Northwest seemed to offer everyone who showed up looking for a fresh start. Think about that for a second. She traveled across the country for a vacation and loved the place so much she decided to start her whole life over. That takes courage. That takes hope. That takes the kind of optimism that makes you believe good things are waiting for you somewhere new. Renee was a nurse, and she was good at it. The kind of person who remembered your name after meeting you once, asked about your family members by name, made you feel like you mattered. Her mother, Carol Powell, would later describe her as caring, compassionate, and insightful. Renee loved to write. She kept journals filled with essays about life, about dreams, about the future she was building in this city she'd fallen in love with. She had plans to continue her education, to advance her nursing career, to keep growing and learning. On the night of February 24th, 1995, she was home doing ordinary things. She'd made herself iced tea. She was folding laundry fresh from the dryer downstairs. Maybe she was thinking about work the next day, or what she'd do that weekend, or whether she'd call her mother soon. Normal thoughts. Safe thoughts. The kind of thoughts you have when you believe your apartment is your sanctuary. Barbara Walsh was 54 years old and lived just feet away from where Renee had lived. She also worked in healthcare. She also lived alone. She also had a ground floor apartment in the same complex at 2202 NE 197th Place in Shoreline. She had built a quiet, independent life for herself. She was the kind of neighbor who kept to herself but always waved when she saw you in the parking lot. And on March 25th, 1995, at 1 a.m., exactly 1 month and 1 day after Renee's ending, firefighters responded to another blaze. Same apartment complex, same cul-de-sac, same type of victim, same horrifying scene. Both women had been bound with electrical cords cut from their own lamps. Both had been gagged with their own clothing and undergarments twisted into restraints. Both had been assaulted. Both had been stabbed repeatedly. Both had items stolen from their homes. And both crime scenes had been deliberately set on fire, with multiple ignition points designed to destroy as much evidence as possible. The parallels were impossible to ignore. These weren't random attacks. These weren't crimes of opportunity. Someone was hunting a specific type of victim in a specific location using a specific method. Someone who lived close enough to watch these women, to learn their routines, to know when they'd be vulnerable. Detective Sarah Collins stood in what remained of Renee Powell's apartment and felt her stomach drop. 20 years on the job, and she'd never seen anything quite like this. The fire had been set intentionally. That was obvious from the multiple points of origin. But the brutality of what happened before the fire, that's what haunted her. That's what would keep her awake at night for the next 2 years. The crime scene told a story if you knew how to read it. The killer had removed smoke detectors from the apartment before starting the fires. Think about that level of planning. This person wasn't acting on impulse or rage. They were calculating. They were methodical. They knew exactly what they needed to do to give themselves time, to delay discovery, to maximize the destruction of evidence. The electrical cords used to bind Renee had been cut from her own lamps with precision. The clothing used to gag her had been selected deliberately. Items were missing from the apartment: electronics, valuables, small things that could be easily carried and sold. But this wasn't just a robbery. Robberies don't end with bodies staged like crime scene messages. Robberies don't end with ice picks placed as signatures. When Barbara Walsh's apartment caught fire a month later, Collins was called to the scene immediately. She took one look and knew. Same apartment complex, same cul-de-sac, same type of victim. Barbara's hands had been bound with electrical cord. She'd been strangled with such force that the ligature marks were still visible despite the fire damage. She'd been stabbed. Multiple fires had been set throughout her apartment. The smoke detector was missing. Collins stood between the two crime scenes, just 130 feet apart, and felt the weight of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just a double case. This was a predator who'd found his hunting ground and might strike again. The thought of a third victim kept her up at night. But here's the terrifying part that Collins discovered when she started digging through databases of the 6,000 cases of people being ended in Washington and Oregon over the previous 2 decades. Investigators couldn't find a single other one that combined all these elements. Sexual assault, theft, binding with victims' own items, and arson. Not one. Either they were dealing with someone who had just started and was still developing his pattern, or someone who was incredibly careful about not leaving a trail that could be tracked across jurisdictions. Both possibilities were equally disturbing. The community reaction was immediate and intense. 600 tips came flooding into the police hotline in the first few weeks. Neighbors started eyeing each other with suspicion, wondering if the person who'd smiled at them in the parking lot could be capable of something like this. Women in the complex installed extra deadbolts, chains, peepholes. Some moved out entirely, unwilling to stay in a place where 2 of their neighbors had been ended in their own homes. The apartment complex that had seemed so safe, so quiet, so perfect for single professionals, now felt like a hunting ground where anyone could be next. Tip number 316 seemed promising. Gary Dolan, 23 years old, unemployed, living about 3 miles from the crime scenes. His own sister called the tip line. She'd found his poetry collection filled with violent fantasies about ending the lives of elderly women. Collins felt her pulse quicken. Everything about Dolan fit. This had to be their guy. They followed Dolan for days, waiting for him to discard something they could test for DNA. When he finally threw away a cigarette, detectives practically dove for it. They rushed it to the lab. The DNA results came back, and Collins felt the air leave her lungs. No match. Gary Dolan wasn't their guy. The case started to go cold. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Collins kept working the evidence, kept reviewing the crime scene photos. But hope was fading fast. 2 years after the fires, the break finally came from a jail cell. Princess Gray sat in King County Jail, absolutely furious. She'd been arrested for assaulting her ex-boyfriend, Robert Parker, and his new girlfriend in a courthouse brawl. But now, sitting behind bars with nothing but time and rage, Princess decided to make a phone call. She told investigators about stolen items, more than 30 of them that she claimed Robert Parker had brought home after the fires. A London Fog raincoat, silverware, wire sculptures, a hand-painted vase, stereo speakers, a VCR. She described them with impossible accuracy, down to specific details that had never been released to the public. Collins's hands shook as she took notes. Princess said that on the night of Renee Powell's ending, Robert had come home with frozen pork chops, about $30 in coins, and 8 bottles of wine, all stuffed inside a black duffel bag. She said he'd scattered pepper throughout their apartment to throw off tracking dogs. She said he'd bragged about what he'd done. When detectives searched the apartment, they found everything she'd described. The families identified the items immediately. This was their property stolen from 2 crime scenes, sitting in Robert Parker's apartment. Collins felt like she could finally breathe. They had him. But then love got in the way of justice. Princess and Robert reconciled. Think about that. The woman who'd just handed investigators a double-ending case suddenly changed her story completely. On December 8, 1996, Princess told police she'd made everything up. She said Robert was with her at her mother's house the night Renee Powell was ended. She said that on the night of Barbara Walsh's ending, she'd run outside to see the fire and found the victim's belongings near a trash can. Just found them. Collins wanted to scream. Defense attorneys would have a field day. A vengeful ex-girlfriend who first incriminated Parker, then recanted. It would look like revenge, like anything except the truth. But Collins couldn't let it go. Something Princess had said in her original testimony kept echoing. She'd mentioned Robert's strange habits after intimacy, how he'd clean up with towels and leave them scattered around the bathroom. The towels found at Barbara Walsh's apartment, wadded up on the bathroom vanity, somehow surviving the fire that had consumed almost everything else. Collins rushed to the evidence locker with trembling hands. The singed towels from Barbara Walsh's bathroom had been sitting in storage for nearly 2 years, carefully preserved in sealed evidence bags. The forensic technician carefully unfolded them under bright laboratory lights, using tweezers and extreme caution, looking for anything that might have been protected from the flames by the folds of fabric. Hidden in the folds of one towel were 4 hairs. Just 4. Microscopic evidence that had somehow survived a fire designed to destroy everything. And one of them, just one, had a root with tissue still attached. A microscopic miracle. That tiny root, barely visible even under magnification, contained DNA. The lab extracted the genetic material using techniques that were still relatively new in the mid-1990s. They amplified it using polymerase chain reaction, making millions of copies of the DNA sequence from that single root. Then they ran it through comparison against the DNA samples they'd collected from Robert Parker after his arrest. The results came back with a number that made Collins close her eyes in relief and whisper a prayer of thanks. 1 in 5.7 billion. The statistical probability that this hair belonged to someone other than Robert Parker was virtually impossible. The hair belonged to him. He had been in Barbara Walsh's bathroom. He had used her towel. He had left a piece of himself behind that fire couldn't destroy. But the DNA evidence didn't stop there. Investigators had also found biological evidence on Renee Powell's body during the autopsy. When they compared it to Parker's DNA profile, they got another match. Not just similar, not just close, an exact match. Robert Parker's genetic signature was at both crime scenes on both victims. Think about what this means. Princess Gray's testimony might have wavered. Witnesses might have been unreliable. But DNA doesn't change its story. DNA doesn't recant. DNA doesn't care about relationships or revenge or who's angry at whom. The science was ironclad. While Princess Gray's testimony had become problematic for prosecution, the DNA was unshakable. Robert Parker had been in both apartments. He'd left traces of himself that fire couldn't destroy, that time couldn't erase, that no amount of denial could explain away. At 5:47 a.m. on November 5, 1996, the SWAT team hit Robert Parker's apartment. That's the optimal time for arrest, when suspects are caught between sleep and waking. The battering ram struck once and the door exploded inward. Robert Parker was 27 years old. He'd moved to Seattle from Arkansas a few years earlier with a criminal record. At the time of the endings, he'd been working at Toys R Us in Northgate. He lived just 130 feet from Barbara Walsh's apartment and 150 yards from Renee Powell's place. He could see their apartments from his window. He could watch them. He could learn their routines without ever leaving his home. When the SWAT team pulled him out of bed, Parker immediately denied everything. He'd never been in those apartments, he insisted. But Collins pulled out the DNA analysis, pages of scientific certainty that destroyed his denials. Princess Gray was there that morning, standing in the corner with a complicated expression. She was the woman who'd given him up, taken it back, but whose words had set everything in motion. The trial of Robert Parker began on November 30th, 1998, in King County Superior Court. Nearly 4 years after the endings, the families of Renee Powell and Barbara Walsh would finally get their day in court. Judge Sharon Armstrong presided over what would become one of Seattle's most watched criminal cases. The courtroom was packed every single day. Media trucks lined up outside. The public wanted answers. The families deserved justice. Prosecutors Regina Cahan and Donald Raz painted a picture of a methodical predator. Robert Parker had stalked his victims, they argued. He'd learned their patterns. He'd discovered when they did their laundry. Always at night, always in the basement, always leaving their doors unlocked for just those few minutes while they moved clothes from washer to dryer. He'd watched them. He'd waited. He'd learned. Those moments of trust became opportunities for violence. These women had lived in this complex for months, for years. They felt safe. They'd done their laundry the same way dozens of times before without incident. But on those particular nights, someone was waiting in the shadows. Someone who'd been watching, someone who knew their routines better than they realized. The prosecution's theory was chilling. Parker had been in a tumultuous, violent relationship with Princess Gray. Instead of dealing with his rage toward her, he'd transformed it into deadly violence against women who resembled her. Women in their 40s and 50s who lived alone. Women he could control completely. Renee Powell and Barbara Walsh weren't random victims. They were surrogates, stand-ins for the woman he really wanted to hurt. This wasn't about robbery or assault. This was about power and control. The defense team, led by Anne Mahoney, Howard Phillips, and Marcus Naylor, tried to poke holes in the DNA evidence. They argued the hair found in the towel had been discovered more than a year after Barbara Walsh's ending. They suggested contamination was possible, that DNA science was still new enough to be questioned. They pointed to Princess Gray's recantation, arguing this case was built on a vengeful ex-girlfriend's word. She was angry about Parker's new relationship. She was facing jail time. She had every reason to make up a story that would destroy him. But the evidence kept piling up. More than 30 stolen items found in Parker's apartment. A London Fog raincoat, silverware, a black duffel bag the families recognized. Princess's detailed testimony about Parker's behavior, the frozen pork chops, the coins, the wine, the peppers scattered to throw off tracking dogs. The DNA at both crime scenes matched Parker with odds of 1 in 5.7 billion. Parker had no alibi for either night. The method of operation was so specific it pointed to one person. The geographic proximity. Parker lived 130 feet from Barbara Walsh and 150 yards from Renee Powell. During the penalty phase, after the guilty verdict, the defense brought in Parker's mother, teachers, and a psychologist to testify about his difficult childhood. The jury heard that he'd been diagnosed with intellectual disabilities in first grade. He'd struggled throughout his education, falling behind his peers. He'd been fired from McDonald's for working too slowly. His mother testified through tears that he'd always gotten along with everyone, that she couldn't understand how her son could have done these horrific things. His attorneys begged the jury to show mercy, to choose life in prison instead of execution. They argued that execution wouldn't bring these women back. They argued that Parker's intellectual limitations made him less culpable, less able to fully understand the magnitude of his actions. They argued that ending his life would just add another ending to an already tragic situation. The prosecution called Carol Powell, Renee's mother, to the stand. The courtroom fell into complete silence as this grieving mother described her daughter's dreams, her compassion, her extraordinary love of writing. She read an essay Renee had written years earlier about hope and new beginnings, about finding a place where you belong, about building a meaningful life worth living. Her voice broke multiple times during the emotional testimony. People in the gallery wept openly. It was devastating to hear a mother speak about a child who'd been ended in such a brutal way, whose life had been stolen just as she was building something new in Seattle. Carol Powell looked directly at the jury and told them about the phone calls she'd never receive again, the holidays without her daughter, the grandchildren who would never exist. On February 25, 1999, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty. Guilty on 2 counts of aggravated ending of life. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree arson. The word guilty echoed through the packed courtroom 4 times, each one landing like a hammer blow. Robert Parker sat quietly as the verdict was read, his face expressionless. One of his attorneys stood next to him with a hand on his shoulder. Another attempted to comfort him as reality set in. In the gallery, relatives and friends of Renee Powell and Barbara Walsh hugged each other and wept softly. Relief mixed with grief, mixed with exhaustion. They'd waited 4 years for this moment. Outside the courtroom, Parker's mother sobbed uncontrollably, repeating over and over through her tears, "I can't take him home. I can't take him home." Her son would never be free again. Would Robert Parker be executed, or would he spend the rest of his life in prison? Prosecutors argued there were no mitigating factors to merit leniency. 2 innocent women had been bound, assaulted, stabbed, and burned. They'd simply lived alone in ground-floor apartments. The defense continued to plead for mercy, emphasizing Parker's intellectual disabilities and troubled background. On March 8, 1999, the jury made their choice: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The families respected the decision. They just wanted him locked away forever, where he could never hurt anyone else. Robert Parker was formally sentenced on March 15, 1999. Parker appealed his conviction. His attorneys argued various points about the admissibility of evidence and the reliability of DNA testing. On December 23, 2002, the Washington Court of Appeals issued their decision. The appeals court upheld his conviction. They found that the DNA evidence had been properly collected and analyzed. They found that Princess Grace's testimony had been appropriately handled. They found no errors significant enough to overturn the jury's verdict. Robert Parker's conviction was final. As of 2025, Robert Parker remains incarcerated in the Washington State Prison System, serving his life sentence without possibility of parole. He's now in his early 50s, having spent more than half his life behind bars for the crimes he committed in 1995. The case was featured on Forensic Files in a 2009 episode titled Sign of the Crime, detailing how a single hair surviving a fire led to Parker's conviction and bringing renewed attention to the investigation. True crime podcasts and blogs have revisited the case in recent years, examining the role DNA evidence played in securing the conviction. Some online crime enthusiasts have even suggested Parker might be connected to other unsolved cases with similar methods. But no evidence has ever linked him to any crimes beyond the 2 he was convicted of in Washington. The families of Renee Powell and Barbara Walsh have largely stayed out of the public eye since the trial concluded. They got the justice they sought, even if it came at a devastating price. No legal proceedings could bring back the women they lost. But at least their destroyer would never walk free again. The apartment complex where the crimes occurred still stands in Shoreline, though it's been renovated and renamed in the decades since. New residents live in the units where Renee and Barbara once lived, most likely unaware of the horrific events that took place there in 1995. The Seattle fire case represents something important in criminal justice. It shows how evidence can survive even when someone tries desperately to destroy it. Robert Parker thought fire would erase his crimes. He set multiple ignition points in both apartments, removed smoke detectors, and did everything he could to ensure maximum destruction. But he couldn't account for one folded towel protecting a single hair. He couldn't predict that DNA analysis would identify him with virtual certainty. He couldn't foresee that his own girlfriend's rage would lead investigators directly to him, even after she tried to take it back. Princess Grace's testimony swung wildly from detailed incrimination to complete recantation. In many cases, that kind of unreliability would doom a prosecution. But here, her initial statements gave investigators the direction they needed to find physical evidence that couldn't change its story. The DNA didn't recant. The stolen items didn't disappear. The forensic evidence stood firm even when witness testimony wavered. Detectives followed more than 600 tips. They surveilled Gary Dolan for days based on his disturbing poetry, only to have him cleared by DNA. They watched the case go cold for nearly 2 years. They dealt with a key witness who changed her story completely. They had to wait for technology and timing to align perfectly. That single hair could easily have been lost if the fire had burned hotter, if the towel had been positioned differently, if investigators hadn't preserved the evidence properly. Any of these factors could have changed everything. Parker could have walked free, but he didn't. The evidence survived. Renee Powell came to Seattle with dreams of a fresh start. She found a city she loved, built a career helping others, and was planning her future when Robert Parker took it all away. Barbara Walsh was simply living her life, working in healthcare, when she became the second victim of a man who lived just feet from her door. These women deserve to grow old. They deserve to pursue their dreams, to experience all the ordinary, beautiful moments that make up a life. They were daughters who made their mothers proud. They were healthcare workers who cared for strangers. They were women who had the courage to live independently. They were human beings who mattered, who were loved, who left holes in the world when they were gone. Robert Parker stole their futures and tried to burn away his guilt. For a while, it seemed like he might get away with it. But evil leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are microscopic strands of genetic material that refuse to burn. The fire went out. The evidence remained. Justice found its way through the ashes. And somewhere in a Washington state prison, Robert Parker has spent the last 26 years understanding what Renee Powell and Barbara Walsh knew instantly. Some things you can't escape. Some things you can't burn away. Some things survive, no matter how hard you try to destroy them. The truth is one of those things.